Ciao friends, and welcome to a new Unplugged video from SQL BI. In this video, I want to answer a question that one of our readers posed on our forum. I wrote an article quite a few months ago where I explain how to create a calculation that shows the top 3 products plus an additional row containing others. So you have the sales amount of the top 3 products plus an additional row that's named others that contains the sales of all the other products. And a user asked how to transform that into a calculation group. So here we are. I'm going to answer and try to translate the content of that measure in a calculation group. There will be some challenges that we need to work together. Before starting, keep in mind I'm not going to explain how that code works. It's quite intricate, and there is already an article and a video that explain the detail of how to write the top n plus others calculation. So I'm not going to focus on the calculation. I'm basically going to focus only on how to transform that calculation into a calculation group. Let's get started. First, the article. This article, filtering the top products alongside the other products in Power BI, is dated back in January 2021, and it shows a technique that can be used to show, let me see if we have, to create a report that shows the top 3 products, the sales amount of the top 3 products, plus an additional row containing others. Actually, it's not visible here, so it's better if I go to the demo. Okay, here is the file that you can download from the article, and you see that I'm showing in sales amount the top 3 products, just because I chose 3 here, and there is this additional row others that contains the sum of all the other products, that is the products that are not part of the top 3. As I said, I'm not going to explain you how to write the sales amount. We're going to look at the code, we're going to change it, but I'm not going to provide a detailed explanation. That is available in the previous video. Instead, what I want to do is work, I messed up everything, on the question. Let me quickly jump to the question. Here it is. Okay, maybe zoom in a bit. Okay, the question is, thank you for this great video, thanks to you. A step further, I'm writing rank X in a calculation group. And this is the first problem. The code of the measure is quite intricate, and we don't want to go through the palaver of creating that code for each and every measure. That is why a calculation group is very welcome. But then there is actually another question, aiming to use different measures to rank the products. So there are actually 2 questions in the same question. The first is how to transform the entire calculation into a calculation group. The second question is, again, interesting, because it says, I do not want to always rank by sales amount. Maybe I want to show the sales amount ranked by the number of transactions, or I want to show the number of transactions ranked by sales amount. So the number of transactions of the top 3 products are ranked based on the sales amount. So there are actually 2 different questions in the same. The first is how to move it to a calculation group, and that already proves to be challenging. Then the next step will be to make it dynamic regarding the measure used to do the ranking. Hopefully we are going to solve both. I honestly have no clear picture on how to solve both because I don't know the challenges, but that's an Unplugged, so whatever happens is good. I answered to him, unfortunately, a month ago, saying that that would be a great fit for an Unplugged. So it's now time to fulfill my promise and write this Unplugged. I'm going to start from the file that you can download from the original article, and then we first transform the calculation into a calculation group, and then we see what we can do with make it dynamic, the measure used for the ranking. So this is the file that you can download that already contains the matrix and the sales amount. The code of sales amount is not trivial. You see that it contains quite a lot of code. Sales amount first computes the sales of all, then checks if something is in scope, and then there is quite an intricate calculation to produce the result. And right now we are only focusing on this value, so showing these numbers. But then the technique, which again is explained in the article, also uses two different columns. The first one is very well hidden here, and it is this ranking measure that counts 1, 2, 3, 4, and that is used to produce the sorting, because I want to show the first product first and the other rows always at the end. And there's also another measure that is not visible by default, which is in the filters here. That is this visible row. In order to show only the first 3 products, we need to apply a filter for visible rows that says I want to show only the rows where this value is not 0. If I get rid of this filter, you see that I suddenly see all the products. So both techniques need to be handled correctly. Let me put again visible rows in the filter. That should not be 0. Apply the filter. Okay. So we want to obtain the same result with the calculation group. The first step is to duplicate the page, because I'm going to destroy everything and I want to be able to still look at the previous version to check that my numbers are correct. And let's rename it as test. Then what we want to do is transform the code that right now is being computed in sales amount into a calculation group. And we will need to pay attention to a lot of intricate details. But first of all, if we want to create calculation groups, I guess you already know that. If not, it's useful to learn. You cannot create calculation groups using Power BI Desktop. You need to use Tabular Editor. 2, 3, it's up to you to make a choice. I'm going to use 3 just because, come on guys, it's so cool that it's definitely worth using. So first we start Tabular Editor 3 and then we start creating our calculation group. So we go back to the demo and we launch Tabular Editor. In the meantime, I rearrange the windows. I want Tabular Editor on this display and Power BI Desktop on the other one. Okay, here we go. Now we have Tabular Editor, which is there working. And we need to create a calculation group. So we go there, create a calculation group that we cannot name it top N, so let's call it top N filter. Top N filter will have 2 values, yes and no. No will just not do anything, and yes will apply the top N filter to whatever measure is in the report. So the name is filter top N, and the items that I need to create are a first calculation item that I call no. That means I'm not going to do any kind of filtering, and the next calculation item is just yes, and this will apply the filter. No does not do anything at all, so no just evaluates to the selected measure. Whereas yes is where we will need to add the entire logic. Now the thing is, the logic is already here. We have not here in product names, sales amount. We have the code here in sales amount. So let me copy everything. We go to yes. And we paste everything. So this is the same code that previously was in the measure. Now we just placed it into the calculation item. Because this is a calculation item, we need to start changing code. We do not longer compute sales amount. We use the selected measure. And this is no longer sales of all, it's the value of the selected measure for all. So we need to rename it and we call it value of all. That computes the value for everything. Then if the product names is not in scope, we compute value of all. Otherwise, products to rank computes the top end value. This is no longer the sales of the current product, but it's the value of current product, and it's not computing sales amount, it will be computing the selected measure. DAX variable checks if is other is selected. If it's not selected, then it returns the value of the current product. Otherwise, we find the visible products, we compute the sales. We create a table that contains the visible product and the sales amount. This is not going to be sales amount. This is going to be the selected measure. And this is not going to be the sales amount. It's the selected measure amount. So we rename it sell measure amount. Okay, again, this is not sales of top products, but value of top products. We take the top end, products to rank, products with sales. Why do we have products with sales here? Product with values. So we take the top end, products to rank, product with values, and the sell measure amount, which is the value computed here. We sum them together, and this is not the sales of other, but value of others. Now, as it is right now, that might already be working because we just have replaced the code that previously was in sales amount and we place it in a calculation group. So let's start giving it a try. Let me save it, go to Power BI Desktop, refresh. Now, what I need to do is get rid of the measure sales amount. Remember, this complex measure. I don't want this measure. Instead, I want this measure, sales amount. Ranking need to be later. You see that this measure is not working. It is showing others here, but I have not yet activated my calculation item. So next step, we add a slicer with our top end filter. Filter top end, go to a slicer. And the font is unreadable, at least at my age, so we go for 18 points. If I select no, nothing is going to change. If I select yes, it's kind of working, but really kind of, because you see that others now has a value of -3. I need to select yes. If I select no, others ranking has a value of 4, so it goes at the bottom. If I select yes, the calculation happens. I have a value here, but ranking has a value of -3. And yes, this is already interesting. The calculation group is changing not only the value of the sales amount, it is also changing the value of the ranking calculation. The thing is, a calculation item is applied to any measure unless you specify otherwise. So we do not want, we want the calculation item to change the value of sales amount. We do not want the calculation item to change the value of the ranking, because that is going to be used for the sorting. And we do not even want the calculation item to change the value for visible rows or whatever other measure that is a technical measure used inside my calculation. So we need to protect our calculation item. Let's do that. We have this -3 that we don't like. And the problem is that the calculation item, yes, is being applied not only to sales amount, but also to the ranking. So the first step is to avoid the calculation item to work on the ranking. That's not hard, because it's enough to add an if statement at the beginning that says if not is a selected measure the ranking. Okay, if the selected measure is not the ranking, then we do whatever calculation we want. If the selected measure is the ranking, then we return the selected measure. Okay, let me save that, go to Power BI Desktop, and here we go. Now you see that the ranking went back to 1, 2, 3, 4. Now my calculation item is working on the sales amount. It's not doing anything on the ranking. So it is already working, but actually we can do something better, because now that we have a calculation item, we can actually change any measure. Let me see what happens if I get rid of the filter for visible row, because my bet is that it should work. It is not actually. It is not, because the ranking is showing a value and sales amount also is showing a value. Now what I want to do is obtain the same result. Let me put visible row again here. Is not 0. Now this visible row is not 0, is needed in order to show only the first 3 rows plus the 4th one. But the thing is, that was needed because I could place a measure in the matrix that shows values even though the value that shows a value even though that value goes above the 3rd product. But now that I have a calculation item, I can actually check that in the calculation item. So let me check the calculation item and understand it a bit better. Okay, this calculation item checks if the product name is in scope, and that is never the case. We always go here. If not other is selected, then we compute the value of the current product. We check the visible product, the product with values. The value. If not other selected, the value of the current product. Yes, this is the problem. If other is selected, we go here and we do this calculation. But if other is not selected, we return the value of the current product, which is just the value of the selected measure. I could add the protection that blanks out the value when we go over the 4th row here. And by doing that, I will blank out any measure after the 3rd product. Now, the calculation is happening right now in visible row. So let me copy this code, go to my yes calculation item, and I know that I need to do the change here, where I'm doing the calculation for a regular product. That is computing the ranking, which we already have here. So that is, no, it's computing the top end value, which we have already there. So we can take this product to rank and use it here and here. Then it's computing the ranking. And then if the ranking is not blank, and if it is between products to rank and products to rank plus 1, then that should be if result, then value of current product. So I basically moved the check to blank out the measure from the visible row measure in the calculation item. And that should do the trick, because if the ranking of the current product is over the number of products that need to be ranked, the measure will be blank. Therefore, it should disappear. Let me check that. Go back to Power BI Desktop. Now I should be able to get rid of the filter for visible row, and it's working. You see that I removed the visible row filter, and my calculation is still working. I have the sales amount, I have my ranking column that I can hide, and that is showing 37, 30, 25, 580, which is exactly what I wanted. With the big advantage that I can do that for other calculations. So if we create a new measure, let's call it number of transactions that does count rows of sales, and I add it to my report. Now this is showing the number of transactions of the first, the number of transactions of the third, the number of transactions of the second, of the third, the number of transactions of all the others. So now the entire logic of top n plus others is applied to any calculation. And I still have my ranking here. Let me put it at the bottom. No, at the bottom of the list. No way. Go at the bottom, please. Thank you. So the first goal is accomplished. Now we have one calculation group that let me apply the filtering right. I said that I were about to check the numbers. Let's just check 25, 580, and we have 25, 580. So yes, the calculation is still working, and now it is a calculation group. This goes to the next question. Remember, the same question actually contained two different problems. The first one was to transform the top n into a calculation group, and that is accomplished. We now have a calculation group that does the same logic as our top n. The second question was to make the ranking dynamic. That proves to be, I mean, at least from what I'm thinking, that will be a bit more challenging. Let me explain the problem with the demo. Now I have sales amount and number of transactions. Sales amount shows 37, 30, 25, and the number of transactions shows a value. You see that the ranking is happening by sales amount. So Contoso SLR sold more than 8 items, so we show it first. And the number of transactions of Contoso SLR is actually larger than the number of transactions of 8 items. By the way, I can zoom in a bit, so let me go here. So I can zoom here. That makes it easier to read. But look at the third product, Contoso SLR camera. If I rank by sales amount, that product is going to be third. But if I rank it by number of transactions, that should actually be the first. So I'm showing the sales amount ranked by sales amount, and I'm showing the number of transactions ranked by sales amount again. The thing is, what if I want to rank by number of transactions? At least this was one of the questions. Actually, I know this was one of the questions, and I can show that to you if I retrieve, okay, the article here, because that was my answer, and then I asked, do you want to rank by different measures, so the top quantity, top n by quantity, or by sales amount, or do you want to project different measures? Projecting different measures is what we solve right now, but actually what the IRR wants to do is rank by different measures, so top n by quantity or by sales amount. We now have quantity, we use number of transactions, but that's the same. We want to show the sales amount of the top 3 products based on the number of transactions. That is going to be a bit more challenging. Let me go back to Power BI desktop. Actually, let me rearrange the desktops. Okay, because I wanted Power BI desktop. Now, let's take a look at the calculation group. The calculation group does not contain the logic about ranking because it is using the ranking measure somewhere here to define whether they want to return a value or not. Then it retrieves the top n products to rank using the selected measure sales amount. Yes, that is a problem. To retrieve the value of the top products, takes the top n out of the products to rank based on the selected measure amount, which is used here as the selected measure. So what we want to do is to have the selected measure amount and a ranking amount that is going to be used here. So we do the top n based on the ranking, and then we do the selected measure amount, which raises a problem because there the selected measure is the number of transactions. Let me go back here. If my theory is correct, that should be already be working. No, actually no, because I have my ranking. Yes, and ranking is always using the sales amount. So actually I provided the wrong description. The fact that I see only 3 values here depends on the ranking measure, not on the calculation item. And the ranking measure is always using sales amount. Okay, this is the ranking measure. The ranking measure basically duplicates the code, and it aims to compute the ranking position of the current row in the filter context in the list of products. And here I do not have selected measure. I always have sales amount. Sales amount here, sales amount here, and sales amount here. I want to make this dynamic, and that is the first step. That defines whether a product is going to be used or not in the calculation. Then I will also need to go here and change this part, because in the value of top products, I don't need to take the top n based on selected measure sales amount, but I need to take the top n based on whatever calculation the user decides to do. Let's solve first the top n, no, the ranking calculation. Now, for the ranking calculation, I want to make this dynamic, and this is a scenario where I cannot use a calculation group because I want to change the behavior of the code that is inside the calculation group. So what I need to do is do the calculation using a parameter table. So we need first a table, and we can create that here. We cannot create a calculated table from here, so we do that from Power BI Desktop. New table. Let's call it ranking measure that contains sales amount or number of transactions. And we name this column, select columns from here, we call it measure to use, which is value. Okay, now we have a new table that is called ranking measure that contains sales amount or transaction. And we also add a slicer to choose whether we want, yes, there, one measure or the other. So let me take a ranking measure from here, measure to use, get rid of filter top N, and now I can choose sales amount or number of transaction. As you might guess, nothing is gonna happen right now because I'm not using this code. But I can select now number of transaction, and I need to use the selection made here in the other calculation. So in ranking, I don't compute sales amount, but I compute the measure that is required. So I switch on true. And let's add another variable, the measure for ranking, that is the selected value of the table that I call the ranking. How did I call it? Ranking. It's not updated. It doesn't, it's not updated with the changes that happened there. So let me close and reopen Tabular Editor. Or maybe I wasn't looking at it right, but I was not seeing the ranking measure table. Here we are again. Now I have it, ranking measure. So I can go back to my, was that in sales ranking? No. Was that in top N filter, product name? Here it is, ranking. So again, we need the measure for ranking variable that contains the selected value of ranking measure to use. And then this is no longer sales amount, but this becomes a switch over true. And if measure for ranking equals sales amount, then it's actually the sales amount. Otherwise, if measure for ranking is the number of transactions, then we have the number of transactions. By default, if no selection happens, we use the sales amount. So now the value of the sales amount depends on the selection that we made on measure for ranking. This other selected is the same. This code is the same. Sales amount, let me rename it. This is now value. Val. Okay. If there is a value, then we do the ranking, and this can no longer be sales amount. It needs to be the same switch. So let me copy everything and embed inside calculate. Okay, maybe we format it. So now it's a rank X. Over visible products, I messed up everything. So some undo are definitely needed. Yes, because I needed to replace this part. Okay, F6. I need to rank X the visible product, calculate this switch, and then the value. So this is the value, and this is the expression computed row by row. Actually, I don't need calculate because I'm using only measures. Much better. Okay, now this version should work. This version of the ranking should work depending on the selection that I made on the slicer. Let me save it. Go to Power BI Desktop. Now I see 61, 60, 55. You see that now the order depends on the number of transactions. And if I click on sales amount, the orders depends on the sales amount, because this is changing the value of this hidden measure, the ranking. Look at the values here. Contoso, now let's look at Contoso SLR camera that has a value of 3. But if I choose number of transaction, Contoso SLR camera, oh no, it basically went to a different point, because now I have as the first place this ranking. Now the ranking is happening based on the number of transactions. With 61 transactions, this is the top seller. Whereas the one with 61 does not even appear if I only choose the ranking by sales amount. So my ranking right now is working, but I'm not sure about the values here. And we need to check that with Tabular Editor, because now the measure used for the ranking is dynamic. What about the value that we show? That is happening here in top N, no, here in yes. Let's review the code for a while. That does not happen for the ranking. If is other selected, that is fine. The problem is when other is selected, which happens here, we compute, I'm sorry, but I cannot read it. I need to format the code. Okay, we check the visible products. In products with values, here is where I have my problem, because I'm adding the selected measure amount that I need to do this sum, this part, this sum. But this top N, that should not use the selected measure amount, that should use the measure that depends on the slicer. And at this point, it's better to do the code in an easier way. So let me go back to the ranking that I lost. Was that in sales? No. In product names here. I wrote this code here once. I wrote it twice here. I'm not gonna write it for the third time. So it's time to take this code and let me see. I remember there was a refactoring feature, but I don't find it here. Anyway, I can just copy this, create a new measure that we call measure for ranking. Let's call it value for ranking, because that is actually what it is. Value for ranking. And I need measure for ranking. That was here. Let's copy everything. This part, we go here, replace everything, return val. So now this measure is returning the measure that needs to be used for the ranking, depend whether it is sales amount or number of transactions. Okay, do I have an error here? No. Then in ranking, I can get rid of this part, and instead I've used a value for ranking. I do the same here. And all this was needed because I didn't want to replicate the code here again. Because if you remember, we were here, I need to compute the selected measure sales amount, and that is needed for here, but I also need the value for ranking. Value for ranking. And I can use value for ranking. And in the top end, I do not use selected measure amount. Instead, I use value for ranking. So I take the top 3 based on the value that is needed for the ranking, and then I compute the selected measure amount, because that is what I want to compute. Let me save that. Go back to Power BI Desktop. Now, if I show the ranking by sales amount, I show some value. If I go by transactions, now this is the first one. It shows the sales amount of a datum, that is the sales amount for the transaction. And this value, 606, is the value of all the ones that are not in the top 3 based on the ranking that is happening by sales amount. So with sales amount, that should be the same. With transactions, of course, the ranking is assigned to different products and the calculation happens in a different way. Well, I guess that's it. Actually, it is not it, because I made all this code without worrying about non-additivity. So if we look at the code, it's easier if we jump to the code. This calculation, this SUMX, works if the measure we are using is additive. If the measure we are using is non-additive, this is not going to work. Actually, in the article, we show how to use the same calculation in the case where your calculation is non-additive. And you see that instead of having SUMX, we have a more complex calculation that checks a filter, does an accept, and then uses calculate to compute the value on top of any non-additive calculation. I'm not gonna solve that. It would be useful, but let me say I leave this as a useful exercise for the reader, meaning that you need to repeat the entire steps. What we did with the additive calculation, you need to repeat that for the non-additive calculation. Because the thing is, when you work with a calculation group, you cannot make assumptions about the measure being used being additive or non-additive. That is why it is better to use the most generic solution that will work everywhere, both for additive calculation and for non-additive ones. I have no idea how long this video is, but I guess it's time to close it. So let me turn the other way around and say that we made it. Now, what I need to do is just answer the question, say, hey, the video is recording, go there, take a look. As you have seen, changing the logic from a calculation group, from a measure to a calculation group requires paying attention to several details. We had to protect the ranking calculation so that the calculation group does not apply its logic to the ranking calculation. We had to replace a selected measure here and there, replacing sales amount with selected measure. We had the option of getting rid of visible row, which is a technical measure that is quite a pain in the neck. Better to get rid of it and move the entire logic in the calculation group. And finally, we also made it dynamic so that you can rank based on whatever measure you want. I have no idea about performance of this calculation. I do not expect this to be fast because the entire logic is quite intricate, but it is at the same time extremely powerful. You can rank using a measure for the ranking and compute the sum of whatever measure your user places in the report. That is quite cool. So I hope you enjoyed watching the video and as usual, enjoy DAX.